Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this online talk alongside the exhibition Hello Robot, Design Between Man and Machine. In this exhibition, we investigate how technology is shaping our lives, for better or worse, what chances are opening up, and what are the risks we are incurring. So let me jump right in and introduce you to our fabulous guests tonight, Kate Crawford and Guy Hoffman. So Kate is a leading scholar in the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. Over her 20-year career, her work has focused on understanding large-scale data systems, machine learning, and AI in the wider context of history, politics, labor, and the environment. She is a research professor at USC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at MSR NYC, and an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, among many others. I'm sparing the long list. And she has advised policymakers in the United Nations, the European Parliament, the White House, you name it. Kate is also famous for her creative collaborations, such as the data visualization anatomy of an AI system with artist Vlad Agnola. And she's written extensively about the topic, her latest book being Atlas of AI, Power Politics and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence, which has been named one of the best books on technology in 2021 by the Financial Times. Guy, equally amazing, is an assistant professor and the Mills Family Faculty Fellow in the Sibley School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Cornell University. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor at IDC Herzliya in Israel and co-director of the IDC Media Innovation Lab. Guy holds a PhD from MIT in Boston in the field of robotic-human interaction. He heads the Human-Robot Collaboration and Companionship Group, studying the algorithms, interaction schema, and designs, enabling close interactions between people and personal robots in the workplace and at home. Among others, Guy developed the world's first human-robot joint theater performance and the first real-time improvising human-robot jazz duet. His research papers won several top academic awards, and in both 2010 and 2012, he was selected as one of Israel's most promising researchers under 40. His TED Talk, and you want to watch it maybe and check it out, is one of the most viewed online talks on robotics, watched more than 3 million times. So, Guy, you are particularly well suited to give us a quick introduction and a definition. What is a robot, and in comparison to that, what is AI?
Yeah, thank you for this introduction. Thanks for hosting this conversation. I'm really excited to have this discussion with the two of you. And a definition of a robot is hard to give in a way that you can't find good exceptions for. I would say that I would answer this in two ways. And one way is that a robot most generally is some kind of a computer-controlled machine that operates in the physical world. But this can also include, obviously, cars and washing machines. And so this brings me to the second way that we need to think about robots, which is sort of as a cultural artifact and some sort of a long-standing fantasy of humanity of building some artificial creature. And in this sense, I think a lot of times is where robotics really connects with how people think about robotics, which connects with the hopes and fears, I think, of how of what machines can do. So in a sense, a robot is nothing more than a machine that has a computer chip in it. In another sense, it's also a tradition of creating artificial creatures and our connection to that and our understanding of this. And in contrast, I would say AI is a set of different computer science methods and algorithms that are trying to solve things that at some point in history were considered connected to human intelligence. And again, the division is quite blurry. So I think what would be considered AI in the 19th century won't be considered AI today. What we consider AI would probably be considered just some piece of code in 100 years from now. So AI is again, the thing about it is algorithms that solve problems that we think of as similar to thinking. But it's also, I would say it's more precise to think about it as a type of a fantasy that we have about what computers can do.
That's very nice and actually quite true. This is why we're always so disappointed when we see real robots. Kate, your work focuses on artificial intelligence, and people often, I think, underestimate the impact of AI on their daily lives. Could you tell us a little bit where humans are likely to encounter AI these days?
Well, I love the way that Guy just described AI as a type of fantasy, because I think that's exactly right. There's a vision of what AI is supposed to be in marketing and in advertising, which is often represented by, a series of white robots and blue numbers, going into long tunnels. And most people have this impression of AI as being, objective, immaterial, a sort of code in the cloud. But in actual fact, it's a profoundly material technology that has, enormous impacts on our daily lives, all through the supply chain and obviously on the planet as well. And we're probably most familiar with AI on our phones, with services like Instagram and Facebook, which might appear on the surface to be ways in which you can communicate with friends and family and sending messages. But these are in fact enormous AI engines for things like facial recognition, advertising, prediction, and also forms of recommendation engines. Also, a lot of AI systems and machine learning systems are in the back end. You won't even be aware that it's part of what's happening when you're doing a job interview, or as part of a risk assessment scoring system inside the criminal justice system in the United States. There are so many social institutions that are folding in these kinds of functionality, often without very much testing or auditing to see how these algorithms may actually contain significant biases and skews. So in some ways, we can see where AI is in our lives, but in many more places, we can't see it. And they're, in fact, the places where I'm most concerned.
Together with the media scientist and artist Vladan Jola, you created this huge, really gigantic data visualization called Anatomy of an AI System, where you try to make this whole back end visible. And this is why it's so large. It really takes quite a lot of space. It tries to demonstrate this vast networks that underpin the birth, life, and death, if you want, of one single Amazon Echo smart speaker. And that is really interesting because this is a machine that we are quite familiar with these days. And, can you tell us a little bit about that? How did it come about? And also what is it? What are you trying to depict in this gigantic visualization?
Well, it's an interesting story. I actually met Vladan at a retreat in Europe where we were focusing on voice-enabled AI systems. And we were, curious about the fact that so many engineers were really just focused on how do we capture as many voices as possible, and that would somehow be producing more equitable AI. But we were more interested in really researching and charting what does it really take to build a voice-enabled AI system. And initially, I was pretty familiar with the data pipelines and how the actual algorithms work. So we sketched it out on a big piece of paper. But then we started asking, what about the device itself? Where do the components come from? Where are the semiconductor chips being sourced? What are the minerals that go into making these systems? And so began this enormous research project, which took 2 years to trace everything in the supply chain that actually goes into an Amazon Echo, how it's made, how the components are smelted, the container shipping, the data pipelines, and then ultimately the device disposal in the ground, where they get thrown away in places like Ghana and Pakistan, generally after being used for less than 4 years. So very, very tiny moment of time of technological convenience for what is, an enormous impact in terms of the deep time of the planet, how long all of these minerals and components and energy take to actually form in the crust of the planet that we live on. And so this was quite an extraordinary experience for us to really reshape what we understand as the true costs of a technology. And so we try to display that in this enormous visualization. It just opened up at MoMA last month. So if you're in New York, you can go and see it. But it has accompanying with it an essay. And the essay really traces you through these kind of deeper material paths of so many technologies that we sort of just see as things on a shelf or things that we might interact with, rather than things that leave this enormous footprint in terms of how we live.
Can I just comment on this? I think Kate really brings up an important point that has to do with this role of AI and robotics as a fantasy, is that a lot of it, the work is in hiding what actually is going on, and on so many levels, and it goes from university labs that are bringing out their best demos and hiding all the manual grad student work that makes a robot do a certain thing, to just physically hiding components behind a nice clean design of a and they also have these names like a dot and like things that are small and unassuming, and really there's a lot of design work that's being put into hiding the complexities and hiding the labor and hiding the impact and hiding the back end of certain things. Maybe it happens in many cases. I mean, a building obviously tries to hide its plumbing, but in this sense, I think there's like a huge iceberg hidden, as Kate is showing in her work, and that happens on a number of different levels, because I think we want to maintain this type of fantasy of an intelligent machine, even if probably most people won't be able to define what that even means to be intelligent.
I love the way you said that, Guy. And in some ways, I think about it almost as a bait and switch. So many of the systems, particularly in the AI world, will make you feel as though you're just doing one thing, like, oh, compare your face to a Renaissance master painting, and everybody will upload their face to see who they look like. They are, in fact, feeding a back end that is designed for creating an enormous training data set that will be used to create a different model for a completely different purpose. And you have no idea what that purpose is, but you've just participated in something that's pretending to be something else. And this is so common throughout the kind of the pipelines of artificial intelligence. And it makes me think of the work of philosophers like Hart and Negri, who use this concept of the relationship between abstraction and extraction. If these things look abstract and well-designed and, as you say, unobtrusive, they are actually disguising the way in which they are, in fact, extractive. They're extracting data from us. They're extracting images of our faces, of how we speak, of how we interact, right down to the sort of micro movements that we might make when we feel an emotion, are now all part of the terrain of extraction and profit-making for artificial intelligence. And you've hit on, I think, one of these most important dynamics, which is this dynamic of hiding. And sort of how do we make those sort of deeper networks visible is, I think, a really important research task.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, what is the business model behind hiding? Or rather, what is the business model so that there is this huge effort that goes into hiding? I find that quite intriguing and also a little bit scary.
Well, I think Guy put it well. You can't have the fantasy if you can see the reality. And so much of this at the moment is the business of fantasy, of sort of mimicking intelligence. One of the things that I did for the Atlas of AI book is really go and visit the factories where people are labeling AI data and sort of trying to make AI systems appear intelligent, all the way through to actually pretending to be AI systems. So people, in India and in Malaysia are being paid by the hour to pretend to be an automated assistant. There are so many forms of what Astra Taylor calls faux-automation or fake automation built into these systems to give us the impression that they are intelligent. And this is also part of the ongoing magic trick / fantasy of how these systems are being introduced to us.
The author Bruce Sterling, who was one of our advisors for the exhibition, when I first met him, he said, "You don't need an exhibition. You need to hire actors and then send them on a performance tour for a couple of years, because that's what robots really are. They're a fantasy. They're just fiction." And the interesting thing is also that the word robot, as I'm sure both of you know, was not invented in a lab, but on stage. It's a theater play from 1920. And I think this is quite telling, says it all. And yet we have these systems and they have very real impact on not only the earth in terms of, the material that goes into it and the waste that it produces, but also how we live with it and also how it has changed our role in how we interact with objects, because we used to be consumers or citizens at best, and then users, and now we have basically become the commodity, right? So could you talk a little bit about this data mining or data extraction that you've mentioned? So
you're making a very good point, and I also want to make sure that we don't get stuck on this fantasy idea, because there's a reality that's happening as well. And the reality is, if I would want to be precise, is a reality of massive data collection, as you're saying, of massive use of statistics and a deep faith in statistics as a way to be able to predict and control people. And so this is the reality of AI, which actually is happening. And this is also in part what is being sold to investors and to the business that are trying to make this happen. So if I would characterize the era we live in, it's an era of willing self-monitoring that has entered pretty much every part of our lives, where we are walking around with a very high precision and high multimodal data collection machine. And it affects, labor. It affects the way that people work. It affects the way that people's work is evaluated. It affects personal relationships, how people meet, how people, start relationships, start families. It affects how relations between parents and children. It really has, in a way, without much public, how would you say it? Public agreement or public consent, become the de facto driving force of many human relationships. I think robotics, in a sense, is still a little bit behind in terms of the technology readiness to make a big impact. But from what we hear from entrepreneurs and investors, this is definitely something that should be changed. I'm more skeptical about the capability of robotics in the near term. But if we think about what the social program is for robotics, it's definitely in the same line of data collection, making humans less necessary in different locations. I sort of wrote an online note on Medium a few years ago, where I said we're not just, like, AI in a way is getting closer to being human, partly because we're getting stupider. The whole system is set up to kind of pull humans down and pull AI up, and then make it look like there's an acceleration of AI towards human intelligence. For example, if we used to converse in complex, with complex modalities, people are mostly communicating using text, text messages, email. So text is great for AI. It's easy for AI. So we would love everybody to use text, because then AI can be as good as a human. But AI won't be as good as a human if you had to put them face to face with a human. So similarly in navigation, we used to know how cities we used to be able to get around. Now we're just as bad at navigating as AI is at navigating. And we seem to think that AI has become so great at navigating just because we have completely forgotten how to navigate. And so in a way, I would say that AI is really inserting itself, and by AI, really what I mean is data collection and statistical prediction, which is not very intelligent in my opinion, and it's very easy to break, and it's continuously easy to break, and so this I would say this is how I see the current moment and how AI shapes our society. And again, robotics, I think, is still a little bit further away, but has its own. I don't think it has a very different type of problem. I think it's a similar problem with a different application.
I think you've hit on a dynamic that has really, it's really been quite extraordinary to see in situ, going to factories that are using a lot of robotics. I spent a lot of time inside Amazon's fulfillment warehouses in the United States to research precisely those types of places of a human robotic collaboration, although of course it's a forced collaboration. These workers don't get the option to decide how and when they will collaborate with the sort of robotic forces inside a fulfillment warehouse. But it's interesting because my overall impression of these places was not only this the physical strain. You could see lots of arm and wrist support bracelets. There were lots of evident injuries, but also the sort of the psychological pressure of working to maintain what's called the algorithmic rate, which is the number of items that you should be picking and sorting into containers and into boxes. And that combined type of pressure of multiple points of automation, of trying to physically engage with robots as well as psychologically engage with a rate, is actually really, profoundly dehumanizing. And I think it's interesting the way that you put that, Guy, because in the book I sort of write about how there's this concern that robots are replacing us, but actually what's happening is that we're being treated more and more like robots. People are being seen as merely the kind of fleshy extensions of a highly expensive and well-engineered robotics interface. They were the cheap parts that were harder to build in robotics, like really detailed movements of fingertips and things that were harder to do at a cheap cost. Whereas the Kiva robots, which can just glide around the floor, were really the thing that the warehouse was being built around. Interestingly, one of the things that I discovered in my research was that Amazon had this patent, which they had, sort of put away in their large collections to build a worker cage, which was a gigantic cage that would be attached to the same robotic shelf systems that they use for products, so that workers would literally be in a cage, sort of moving around these spaces. And it was extraordinary when we published at Amazon. Immediately, they very rarely actually respond publicly to any sort of criticism. But in this case, they said, we had no intention to build the cage. We simply designed it as a potential idea. And for me, it's like, well, of course, patents don't always get built, but it's an insight into the corporate imaginary, into how we're envisaging rather this relationship between robots and workers. And the power asymmetries are just extraordinarily clear to see. And for me, that robot cage becomes the sort of symbolic moment of seeing precisely what that vision is going to look like.
Part of this is also this view that the human are sort of like an inconvenient element in the automation of the world. And this again, I see this sort of happening in the Amazon warehouse. I'm sure they wish they wouldn't need the humans,
right?
That are getting injured. But they can still do stuff that the robots just can't do. Similarly, when we think about a company like Uber's fantasy of building autonomous vehicles, it's because the drivers are the big problem. They have to eat and they might have families and all kinds of inconvenient things that autonomous cars don't have, especially if we ignore all the people that need to operate the autonomous cars behind the scenes who also have families. And I feel that this really reminds me of one of the things that Sherry Turkle was writing about at the time, that one of the problems with I don't think she talked about AI. I'm trying to remember what the technology was she was talking about. It might have been actually robotics. Is that human relationships just seem too hard compared to relationships with robots, and I think this is something that we you also see, at least anecdotally, I can see this, among students. I feel like for a lot of them, human relationships are becoming too hard compared to, adding an emoji to a Slack channel, or doing the things that technology tells us is equivalent. When Facebook came out with their when they added the 6 emotions, the 5 additional emotions to the one single emotion. I used to teach a class about media and technology back in Israel. And that just happened when I was teaching the class. And I was like, okay, so now Facebook decided that humanity is not just a single emotion, but it's 6 different emotions. And these are the allowable emotions that you're allowed to use in order to react to anything happening in the world. And obviously these emotions don't include anger, or maybe they include anger, they don't include rebellion. They don't include a lot of things that are not part of the legitimate idea. And I think this idea of that human complexity is inconvenient to people who design the technology, is part of what makes this technology be built for and around, as you're saying, the environments be built for and around the technology, with humans being increasingly an inconvenient parameter in them.
Mm. And you raised one of the most extraordinary stories that still surprises me to this day, which is the idea of the 6 universal emotions. And as part of the book, I researched, where did this idea come from, and why did it get so widely populated inside technical systems? And it traces back to a psychologist by the name of Paul Ekman, who in the 1960s was funded by the CIA to try and discover if there were a set of universal emotions that could be used and detected across the world, across cultures. And, he came up with this very, basic, primitive set, things like happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, etc. And he did these very early cross-cultural studies that were frequently failures because he, didn't understand the cultures that he was working with in Papua New Guinea, and the translation efforts often failed. But this idea of simplifying humans down to a set of 6, easy expressions was just so appealing to so many industries. And in particular, not just in the spaces of defense and the military, where it could be used in a sort of an interrogatory context, but also for advertising and marketing, etc., that it became part of a sort of automated vision of how to do emotion detection. And it's been built, into hiring systems that are used today, into educational systems, into the healthcare system. And this is despite the fact that from the very beginning, from the 1960s, some of the best anthropologists, such as Margaret Mead, were saying, this is ridiculous. It doesn't actually work. It erases cultural difference. You cannot look at someone's face and know what they're feeling inside. Any of us who've, ever worked in a cafe or a movie theater can tell you that just because you're smiling doesn't mean you're having a great day. And of course, that simplistic one-to-one assumption is easy to automate. So it was extremely appealing for AI systems, because you can say this set of muscular movements equal happiness. So we've seen a real push against some of these approaches. And interestingly, that in recent years, we've had a couple of major companies withdraw emotion recognition because it simply couldn't be scientifically validated. We've had enormous review studies that show that this doesn't work. And yet I keep seeing tools getting produced every day where people are offering this type of ability to see into someone's soul by looking at their face. And it's precisely these type of sort of myths and, I think, deeply problematic desires to want to know more about people than they're willing to tell you that are driving these types of industries and these types of claims. And I think that's a really good example of where it is absolutely pseudoscientific.
Yeah, and I think the sad and somewhat dangerous part is that the technologies then are designed for us to express ourselves in these limited ways. So in a sense, I think that the technology is trying to simplify its problem in recognition, thereby designing, contracting and constraining environments for us to live in and express ourselves and fall in love in and work in, that then actually produce this limited behavior, which is convenient for the machine. But it then also seeps out into difficulty to accept the richness and complexity of day-to-day life. And I think I am personally, I have this like, huge pet peeve if people respond with emoticons on things. Maybe it's just my age, but I was like, you did nothing. You just clicked a button with a picture on it, and this does not. I don't feel like you're like this is a response, and it's getting more and more convenient. But in a sense, this will then validate this idea that there's only 6 ways that people want to express themselves.
Oh yeah.
So but by constraining the tools, you then create a reality of humanity that fits the wrong model you had when you started developing the technology.
That's it. It creates a cultural feedback loop. I mean, if I may, it's and you can't really blame people because, for example, when one of the major sort of hiring automation tools in the US released its emotion detection system, immediately people were also releasing guides to how to shape your face into the right types of emotional shapes that will make you look like an ideal employee and get you hired. So of course, people are molding themselves into the forms of expression that are made available to them, that they also know that they'll be assessed by in school, in the workplace, etc. So it really is a sort of a ratcheting system where you will start to see these really kind of closing feedback loops where I think we ultimately limit what it is to be human.
Talking about stereotypes and simplification, I would like to give the discussion a little shift towards bias. You both speak about bias quite a lot. Can either of you explain a little bit how this unfolds in real life and what it is that we should be discussing when we speak about bias in technology?
I'll let you start, Kate. I think you're a bigger expert than I am on this.
I mean, it's interesting. I think in many ways I've been researching this field for well over a decade, and it was interesting that, in the big data era, that people used to say, bias is not a problem. The more data we have, the less biased our system will become. So essentially, when I started researching this subject, many years ago, people were convinced that with more data, bias would simply become a non-issue. But of course, the opposite happened. With large amounts of data, you have significant skews based on all sorts of historical patterns, forms of structural inequity, and also simply at a large scale of data, people are unable to really become familiar with the data, to really study it, to audit it, to see where it has these sorts of issues. So in many ways, I think of bias as less a flaw that can be technically ironed out or simply erased from a data set than it is actually the feature. It's what happens when you have large amounts of data that reflect on human activities and human behaviors. You will be seeing all of those historical skews, those historical inequities, those types of forms of prejudice and discrimination that have shaped every human culture. And so in many ways, particularly in machine learning, they can act as bias amplifiers, as ways of repeating types of inequity and then hard coding it into a system. So that if, for example, in the stop and frisk system in New York, when it was operational, if it was seeing in the data that it was primarily Black men who are being pulled over, that it would suggest and recommend that you pull over more Black men. I mean, you see how we get these very problematic sort of system reinforcements. So in many ways, I think these days, I'm less interested in almost this sort of bias bug bounty where it's like, oh, there's another one, because it's everywhere. And really looking at this deeper question, which is, what are the politics of classification? What happens when we seek to classify people automatically from their faces into gender, race, sexuality categories? What happens when we assume that by training systems on the data of the past, that they will somehow not replicate those injuries and harms into the future? How do we really open up a much more critical and inquisitive, curious relationship to data rather than assuming it acts as a type of predictive bedrock? Because, as Guy and I know, that's really where the problems begin.
Yeah, and the reason for the So I very much agree with what you said. And I think the reason for it is that machine learning, in the most common way that it's used, it's by definition a conservative technology, because it's conserving whatever patterns it finds into its prediction. And bias was not invented with computers. Bias, was around before, and the reason is that any simplification will have a person draw on their previous experience to make decisions about a current experience. But this is all there is. But in reality, though, there's always, I would say, the competing forces of conservatism and sort of automatic thinking, and some, let's call it, critique or revolutionary thinking that is in some sort of a dialectic with the conservative thinking. And therefore somebody will come up and say, yes, this is how we've done things before, but no more. This is, I've experienced these problems, or I've seen these problems, and I want to have us change course on something in small or large society. A machine learning system is not built for this. Like, you can't inject surprise in a sense. I mean, you can inject some semblance of fake surprise maybe, but the system is built in a way that is supposed to tell you what happened, and under the assumption that what will happen next is similar to what happened. And this, I think people need to understand the underlying assumption of conservatism that is part of machine learning, because that's how machine learning is designed. It's designed to look at the past in order to predict the future. This is all it is. And it's a good thing to do in many cases, but it has to be balanced out with a more sort of revolutionary sentiment that says, okay, this is not what we want to continue doing. And one of the most impressive examples of AI that I've seen recently is I'm not easily impressed by AI, but I was impressed by this, like this like stable diffusion DALL-E, image generation. It was very, very impressive, but it only generates kitsch, right? I mean, it only generates kind of predictable stuff.
Can you just briefly explain for our audience what DALL-E is?
It is a system that uses a language and an image model to generate images based on a language input. So you give it a sentence, and you can give it a style. And I'm not an expert on how it works, so I won't be able to explain the algorithmic sides of it. I haven't dug into this since it came out. But it basically is using generative models to generate an image, which is something that's been around for a while, using a language input, which also has been around for a while, but it connects it in a way. I think the model is built in a way that it creates very realistic seeming images in a certain style based on the language that was input. But in the end, it will only use styles of the past. Like, you will not see a new style come out of it, because it's just not something that would be possible. And I think this is a place where we need to think about this tension and dialectic and positive conflict between conservatism and progressive thinking. And AI will always only be conservative in the way that it's designed, and that's its role. That's just the tool. It's a good tool for many things, but it can't be made responsible for fixing problems that already exist.
Let's ignore for a moment the data set that goes into the old data that goes into making predictions, and let's look at the people, the people that are behind this. Is it technically even possible to code AI or technology in general that is without bias? Is it even possible, or will the code always reflect the coder?
I mean, I would say that, any type of world building technology is always going to reflect a type of politics, which means there is no unbiased position. There is no sort of apolitical stance to take when you're building a system that reflects on humans and human culture. Any type of prediction is also producing a type of response. And that is actually a very powerful position to be in. And certainly what we're seeing if we look at the AI landscape, is a profound concentration of power. We have, the great houses of AI. We're really talking about, fewer than a dozen companies who are really making these systems at planetary scale. That is an extraordinary industrial concentration, the likes of which we have not seen really since, the oil industry's sort of heydays. So in this way, I think, rather than sort of thinking about can we have a pure and unbiased system, is to always think about the political economy behind these tools. They're built at great expense. They're built in order to generate profits for the people who own them. So in that sense, it's a case of follow the money. What are they optimizing for? Who benefits and who is at risk? And what you see time and time again is that these systems are in fact giving more power to the powerful and further marginalizing the already marginalized. And that dynamic is extremely well established now. Certainly in the last 10 years, we have a lot of evidence to see how that's happening. And certainly in many ways, we see how it could actually continue to get worse. So I think it's really important at this moment to look at the realpolitik of these tools. How do they work? Who do they work for? And who's benefiting? And by asking those questions, I think we can move beyond the kind of more spectacular distractions of every time there's a new thing, if it's like NFTs or if it's like stable diffusion, and to say, okay, but who does this serve? And how are we replicating the past and importing with it the same kind of problematic institutional positions, inequities, and marginalizations that we already had?
Guy, you work for this industry, within this industry. Is there, can you be a rebel within the system? Is that possible?
I'm not a very rebellious person, so maybe that's why I work within this context. I think it's difficult, but increasingly existing, at least in here and there. I would say if I compare it to I've been sort of part, I would say, of this tech world since I was a kid in the 80s, and I'm the stereotypical grew up with an Atari and a Commodore, in the early 80s, and then worked for tech in the 90s and came up in this. So I would say, if we compare what a CS department was like in the 90s to what it is today, there has been headway. I mean, it's not the same. It's not the same cultural and it's not the same cultural makeup that you would see 20 or 30 years ago. So I would say, I would acknowledge that there's been a shift in the conversation that has been very useful. And this is where I think the hope is. To sort of continue on what Kate was saying, is that part of the bias is also just who are the people who are building the technology. So not just who is profiting from it, not just the top echelon or the investors, but what type of person do you have to be to have a computer in the 80s like I did? Like a person who's not very social, a person who thinks people are difficult, and in many cases a person who grew up in the United States. So you already have a bunch of things that doesn't apply to most people in the world. And when these people who I was part of, let's say I am part of, luckily I don't design any technology that anybody uses because I work in academia, but people like me will have designed the tools that everybody uses to get around their city. And I think this is sort of the bias, that the additional type of bias is like the people who are not only I'm sort of like harking back to my to the class I was teaching 15 years ago, but I was saying people in California think everybody's like people in California, which is not true for pretty much 99% of the world. And I remember the first time I visited California, I was already in my late 20s when first time I was in the United States, and I was visiting California. And before this, I've seen Yahoo Maps. And I was like, why would anybody use Yahoo Maps? Why don't people why would you look for a restaurant on a computer and then use a map to get to the restaurant. This was completely foreign to me. I grew up, in Germany and in Israel, and the restaurants are downstairs, and you walk out and you choose one. And then I came to California, and it was in the late 90s, 97 or 98. I was almost 30, and I rented a car because they told me I should rent a car, which was very foreign to me. And I realized there was nowhere to walk. Like, you literally had to drive from your office to a restaurant, and you can't get into a car without knowing where you're going. So it suddenly, at that point, really clicked to me that people who made Yahoo Maps don't live the same life that I do. And while Yahoo Maps seemed to be completely silly to me, it was necessary for people who live in Silicon Valley. And I think this type of bias is really inherent in a lot of this. I kind of avoided the whole rebel thing. So I don't know if you can be a rebel. I'm not I'm not a very rebellious personality. I'm happy to see that more types of people are working on technology than in the late 90s, where it was very, very homogenous. It still is, obviously, highly biased, but it's not a complete, not everybody is pretty much a clone of the person sitting next to them.
There's this very famous quote by Oppenheimer, who, as we all know, developed the atomic bomb. And he said, when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it. Am I right to assume that neither of you would agree? Where are your red lines? I'm really interested to know.
It's interesting too, because of the history of the Manhattan Project and the relationship to how to think about the lasting impact of the tools that we build. And it really has been the part of this industry that has been the least well considered or funded or supported, is what are the guardrails, what are the checks and balances, what are the ways in which we can even just test and critically assess a system before it's trialed on millions, nay, billions of people. There became, I think, a very significant ideological shift in the early 2000s, as we started to see companies like Facebook literally have mottos like move fast and break things, and of course what ended up getting broken was like multiple forms of democracy, multiple forms of privacy. We can think of the list of breakages is actually quite substantial at this point. And so I think in many ways, there's a dynamic that we've been really tracing in this conversation, really, which is a question of who's in the room. If you have a very homogenous group of people who assume that the world is like them, that they're not necessarily going to have red lines because they've had a very privileged life. It's like nothing can go wrong. I want to design a system where food gets delivered to my door. That sounds great, without thinking about what are the labor politics of the people who will be doing this. What are their experiences? How does this change the ecology of the way food is produced in my town, in my city, in my country? There are so many steps and stages that haven't been part of a very narrow computer science oriented education, which is deeply siloed from the social sciences, the humanities, the design disciplines that may touch on these kinds of deeper social and historical questions. And so it's been interesting, I think, to hark back to your earlier question, that some of the most profound critiques of technology have come from people on the inside. I'm thinking here of people like Timnit Gebru at Google, Frances Haugen at Facebook. There's been some very high profile whistleblowers who've been saying, this is not working. We have serious problems that are not being addressed. And I think it's a concern if the only safety brake we have are individuals having their own red lines. I do not see this as an individual action problem. While it's always fantastic for people to have an ethical system that they adhere to in their work, this is a systemic failure. This is a systemic failure of everything from regulation, from the public being included in these debates around how technology will shape core social institutions. And it's also a failure of thinking about what are the ways in which we refuse technology. I think in so many ways, the last 15 to 20 years of, tech utopianism really meant that we got out of shape. We forgot to exercise that muscle of refusing a technology, of saying, well, that seems to be okay in this context, but not in this context, or I don't want facial recognition in my housing system, or I don't want to have emotion recognition in my kid's school. The ability to actually refuse a technology, I think, is one of the most important technological muscles that we need to exercise right now. And that is a collective action problem. I don't want that to be left to, one Google engineer having to decide to be a good guy that day. That's not the type of ground that we want to be balancing our democracies on.
And similarly, you don't want to have this responsibility on an individual. You can't expect a certain person to have more willpower than how much Instagram is fun. I think this is a solution that won't work, and I think it's never worked. It doesn't. It's not a problem we're encountering for the first time. Unregulated, highly impactful technologies will go as far as society lets them go, and yeah, totally. Kate was saying perfectly. It's not up to a certain individual to say that they have red lines. I think the society has to, as much as we can, be knowledgeable about the reality of the technology. I think something like the Atlas of AI is a step towards this. It's like having to understand. I think knowledge is really where it starts. People need to understand what is actually happening, and then people as a collective need to set the goals and values, and basically tell technology producers and distributors what the red lines are. And so this is how I would see it. I wouldn't say, I almost would say that it's unfair to ask Oppenheimer to not get excited about designing the atomic bomb. And it's ineffective because somebody else will be excited. It is exciting to build something that works and hasn't been built before. And therefore, I think it is important for the tools of society, government and whatever tools you have, parliament, nonprofits, the tools of society to set the boundaries. And I feel it's started to happen. I think this is what, when I look around me, it is definitely happening. I'm not saying everything has been solved, but I'm saying it doesn't look like it looked 10 or 20 years ago. And so individuals brought about a change that's becoming bigger than them.
The way you speak about this really reminds me of how we speak about drugs in relation to our children. How do we build their resilience so they can resist the drug? But obviously, there's legislation. It is hard for children and adults to get hold of drugs. So we need regulation, right? This is ultimately what we need. We need laws. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Without question, what's interesting is to see how few laws we've had in the last decade, and how much money has been spent to try and slow down a regulatory process that honestly people have been calling for a long while. But we at the same time have seen the increasing exponential power of the tech sector. If you just look at, the richest companies in the top 20 from this year to say 10 years ago, it's even despite the recent market crash, you're still looking at some of the richest men and richest companies in the world in this specific AI sector. So I think we are having to think about what force regulators can bring. Obviously, in the EU, you have a draft AI Act, which is the first omnibus piece of legislation to really contend with artificial intelligence. I would say in some ways it has many flaws. It's not strong enough in many ways, but it's the first step. And if we compare that to the United States, where there is no similar regulation at all. In fact, there's not even very strong federal privacy protection, let alone laws that are really contending with the extraordinary power of some of these tools to really manipulate and shift people's experience of life and reality. So in this sense, we're seeing a real regulatory lag. And of course, so many companies will attempt to, really avoid these regulations for as long as they can. So we have to think about regulations, yes, also industrial norms. How can industries start to say that there are some things we won't do? There are some red lines that as companies, as industries, we won't cross. And then also, how do we as people say, no further, this is it? We will say we will not buy these systems that are used for, neighborhood surveillance, like an Amazon Ring camera. We won't use systems that we see are actually creating forms of greater inequality in terms of, things like Uber and food delivery services. And how can we start to see already forms of unionization and workers actually resisting these systems that are clearly having materially negative impacts? So I think there's multiple things that have to be done, but certainly there's a moment now where, the disparity between the power of this sector and the few regulations we have is really quite extreme.
And I also, again, from my personal perspective, I feel the university has a big role in this and has played a very positive role in this and the university and science in general is getting a little bit out of fashion, but I feel like it is where people can think in a way that's independent of the commercial pressures. And it's where the engineering students are going to meet anthropology students and social science students and have discussions about this. And in a way, I think it's an underappreciated role that the university has, especially today, where people who will then go on and only care about the engineering or the finance of something will have to have at least been exposed to somebody who cares about other things. And so in this case, I think I will say that we have to remember the importance of universities and education systems and research institutions to help us stay on course of the things that we care about.
Education, conversation, and regulation. To wrap it up, thank you so much, both to you. This was super interesting. I'm very excited. Thank you. We need to wrap up. Let's hope for the best. And thank you for both your contributions in the field. I think with people like yourselves, we will prevail.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. Thanks. Great.
It's so lovely to meet you, Guy. Lovely to meet you, Amelie. And congratulations on the exhibition. It's truly wonderful.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.